In this next section, we're going to look at savings, investment, and the financial system and see how these relate with long-run growth. Remember, the process of economic growth depends on the ability of firms to expand their operations. So they're going to need to do things like buy additional equipment, train workers, and adopt new technologies. Firms can finance some of these activities from retained earnings. Retained earnings are profits that are reinvested in the firm rather than being paid to the firm's owners. But for many firms, retained earnings are not sufficient to finance the rapid expansion required in economies experiencing high rates of economic growth. If we want to reach really high, really strong economic growth, retained earnings are not enough. So what these firms can do is acquire funds from households. So either directly through financial markets, I'm talking about things like stocks and bonds, or they can do this indirectly through financial intermediaries, so getting a loan from banks. So financial markets and financial intermediaries together comprise the financial system. Financial system is how firms acquire funds from households. Now, without a functioning financial system, economic growth is impossible because the firms will be unable to expand and adopt new technologies. As we noted earlier, no country without a well-developed financial system has been able to sustain high levels of economic growth. It's just not possible for firms to be able to expand their productive capacities without being able to borrow from the financial system. So a financial security is a document, and these can be electronic or paper, stating the terms under which the funds pass from the buyer of the security to the seller. A stock is a financial security that represents partial ownership of a firm. So if you own stock in a company, you're a partial owner. Now, a bond is a little different. A bond is a financial security that promises to repay a fixed amount of funds. So basically, a fund is a loan directly from a household to a firm. And financial intermediaries, these are firms. They can be banks, they can be mutual funds that you invest in, they can be pension funds that help pay for your retirement, and they can be insurance companies. What these financial intermediaries do is they borrow funds from savers. So you as an individual save some money, whether it's in a bank or in a mutual fund, and then those intermediaries lend those funds to borrowers, so to firms that want to expand. So the best part of the financial system is that it matches households that have excess funds with firms that want to borrow funds. But besides this that fuels economic growth, it also provides three key services for savers and borrowers. So the first is risk sharing. Risk is a chance that the value of a financial security will change relative to what you expect. So you buy a share of stock in, say, Chevron for $90, and the price falls to $50. Most individual savers are not gamblers, and they want a steady return, so they don't want to see their stock fall in value almost by half. So what the financial system does is it provides risk sharing. So it allows savers to spread their money across many financial investments. So instead of just investing in Chevron stock, you can invest in many, many companies from using the financial system. So that way, if one company like Chevron tumbles in value, odds are you'll have several other investments that do much better. You'll invest in some firms that do well, and that'll help cancel out those losses. And overall, you'll end up with a steady positive rate of return. The next service of the financial system is providing liquidity. So liquidity is the ease in which a financial security can be exchanged for money. So how easy it is to get money for that thing that you own. The financial system provides the service of liquidity by offering savers markets where they can sell their holdings of financial securities. So say, for instance, you need to make a repair in your house suddenly that you weren't anticipating, and you don't have the money for it. You can quickly sell your stocks or your bonds in a market so you can get that money that you can use to pay that off. The easier it is to sell those stocks or bonds to get that money to fix your house, the more liquid we say that investment is. So things like stocks and bonds that are standardized are very liquid. It's very easy to sell those because there's a lot of people willing to purchase them. There are other assets, though, that are much less liquid. So if it's, say, an old painting that's quite valuable, it's going to be difficult to find a seller for that or a buyer for that. It's not standardized, so you need to look for a person that is looking for that specific asset. So it'll take a lot more time than trying to sell something like a stock or a bond. And the last service of the financial system is providing information. The financial system collects and communicates a lot of information. So it's facts about borrowers, like their creditworthiness, and the expectations about the returns on financial securities, and the strength and health of the companies offering these securities. So let's say a laundromat wants to borrow $10K from you. Finding out what that laundromat wants to do with the funds and how likely they are to pay you back may be costly and time consuming. But if you deposit $10,000 in a bank, you're basically allowing the bank to gather this information for you. And it's much easier for the banks to do that because banks specialize in gathering information about borrowers. So they can do it much faster and at a much lower cost than individual savers. So the financial system, and by using these banks and investment firms, we're able to discover and communicate important information. Now we're going to derive the result that the total value of saving the economy must equal the total value of investment. So when firms use funds to purchase machinery, factories, and office buildings, they're engaging in the process of investment. A key point that we're going to develop, again, is that the total value saving the economy must equal the total value of investment. Investment in terms of the portion of GDP that we talked about in the previous chapter. So national income accounting refers to the methods that the Bureau of Economic Analysis uses to keep track of total production and total income in the economy. So we're going to take these relationships we talked about before to understand why total savings must equal total investment. So let's start with the equation we had for GDP before. So the GDP, or the total income of a nation, represented by Y, is going to be the sum of consumption, C, investment, I, government purchases, G, and net export, or NX. So when we do this, we're going to assume that there's what's called a closed economy. So we're not trading with other countries, and there's going to be no imports or exports. So that removes the NX that we have to worry about. So we're just looking at total income, or Y, equals C plus I plus G. Now what we can do is, using algebra, we can rearrange these to show the relationship between GDP and its components, instead focusing on investment instead of total outcome. When we do that, we have Y, or I, the total investment, equals Y minus C minus G. So that investment in a closed economy is equal to the total income minus consumption and government purchases. Now we can also derive an expression for total saving. Private saving is equal to what households retain of their income after purchasing goods and services, which is component C, and paying taxes. Households receive income for supplying the factors of production for firms. So this portion of household income is going to be equal to Y. Households also receive income from government in form of some transfer payments, which include Social Security payments and unemployment insurance. So we can write this expression for private savings as Y plus TR minus C minus T equals the private savings. So now the government also engages in savings. So public savings, or savings S underscore public, equals the amount of tax revenue the government retains after paying for the government's purchases and making transfer payments to households. So the S public is going to equal T minus G minus TR. So we say that total savings in an economy is equal to the sum of private savings and public savings. So we could also say that that means that savings, or total savings, equals Y plus TR minus C minus T plus T minus G minus TR. So literally combining the components that go into private saving and public savings. Now when we cancel out the terms that cancel, we end up with total savings equals y minus c minus g. The previous two slides end up leading to the same expression for savings and investment. So we can conclude that savings must equal investment, so S equals I. So this long process of going through the different equations for saving and for investment, the purpose of that is to show you guys that savings does in fact equal investments. So when public savings is zero, the government spends exactly as much money as it brings in. This is known as a balanced budget. And the negative and positive values for savings by public, so by the government, are known as budget deficits or budget surpluses. Since the government funds its current deficits by borrowing, so selling treasury bonds, this takes away from the money that's available for investment spending. Over the past 20 or so years, the U.S. federal government has experienced dramatic swings in the state of its budget. So a sharp decline in taxes and increase in government spending resulting from the recession in 2007 and 2009 led to a record budget deficit of $1.4 trillion in 2009, although that's been broken very recently in the response to the coronavirus. As the economy recovered coming out of that recession, the budget deficit had declined to $587 billion by 2016. So we've seen pretty substantial swings in this in just a relatively short amount of time. So in Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, the character Ebenezer Scrooge is portrayed very negatively. For most of the story, Scrooge is extraordinarily reluctant to spend money. So even though he makes a ton of money, he lives in a very cold, dark house that he refuses to heat because it's too expensive, refuses to light it to save money. He eats a very, very simple, bland diet because he doesn't want to pay for expensive food. And Dickens clearly thinks of this as a bad thing. He disapproves of Scrooge's behavior. And at the end of the book, when Scrooge has a change of heart and he suddenly becomes a good person in Dickens' eyes, what he does is spends lavishly on himself and others. But as some economists have pointed out, Scrooge being a miser can actually be a good thing. And the reason why it's generous is because instead of depleting the resources, instead of using all these goods and services, they save money. So by saving the money, this can be used, it can be borrowed by firms in order to improve their technology that's used in the production process. So they can actually become more productive because these funds are available that are, sitting in the bank instead of being actually spent on consumption. So actually, what Scrooge is doing by not spending this money, by leaving it all in the bank, is improving future consumption and future productivity. Okay, so we said that savings has to equal investments, but now let's look at exactly how that occurs. So we can think of the financial system of being composed of many markets through which funds flow from lenders to borrowers. So we have markets for certificates of deposit at banks, the market for stocks, the market for bonds, the market for mutual funds, and so on. But for simplicity, we're just going to combine these all into one market, a market for loanable funds. So a market for loanable funds is a conceptual interaction of borrowers and lenders that determine the market interest rate and the quantity of loanable funds that are going to be exchanged. So for now, we're going to simplify this, and we'll assume that interactions are only between domestic households and between firms. So there's no foreign lenders and borrowers being involved. Again, we're keeping this closed economy, just for simplicity's sake. So the demand for loanable funds is determined by the willingness of firms to borrow to engage in new investment projects. These are things like building new factories or carrying out research and development for new products. When they're trying to determine whether or not to borrow, what firms have to do is compare the return that they expect to make on the investment with the interest rate they have to pay to borrow the necessary funds in order to invest in that. So for example, let's say Amazon is considering opening several new warehouses and they expect to earn a return of, say, 12% on the investment. The investment will be profitable if Amazon can borrow the funds at an interest rate at 8%, so less than their returns. But it will not be profitable if the interest rate is higher, at say 15%. Now, the supply of loanable funds is determined by the willingness of households to save, and by the extent of government saving or dissaving. When households save, they reduce the amount of goods and services that they're consuming and enjoying today. So in the moment, they're going to consume less in order to save. The willingness of households to save rather than consume today is going to be determined in part by the interest rate that they receive when they lend their savings. So the higher the interest rate, the greater the reward for saving and the larger the amount of funds that households are going to be willing to save. Therefore, the supply curve for loanable funds is going to slope upward because the higher the interest rate, the greater the quantity of savings supplied. So the equilibrium in the market for loanable funds is what determines the quantity of loanable funds that will flow from lenders to borrowers in each period. Equilibrium also determines the real interest rate that lenders will receive and the borrowers must pay. So when we draw the demand curve for loanable funds, we're going to hold all factors constant other than the interest rate. So the other things are going to affect the willingness of borrowers to demand funds. And we're going to do the same for supply curve. We're going to hold constant all other factors than the interest rate that affect the willingness of lenders to supply funds. This is just like what we did in the typical markets we talked about in Chapter 3. And because the market for loanable funds is just like any other market, we can deal with the same sorts of shifts in supply and demand curves that we dealt with in regular markets. Let's look through an example right now. So let's say the profitability of new investment increases due to technological change or because the government reduces corporate taxes. If the profitability of new investments increase, firms will increase their demand for loanable funds. So the figure here on the right shows what's going to happen. The demand curve shifts to the right. In this new equilibrium that we see, the interest rate increases from I1 to I2, and the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds increases from L1 to L2. So what I want you to notice here is that an increase in the quantity of loanable funds means that both the quantity of saving by households and the quantity of investment by firms have increased. Increasing investment increases the capital stock in an economy and the quantity of capital per hour worked. So this is what's going to help drive economic growth. Now we can also use the market for loanable funds to see what happens when the government runs a budget deficit. So let's suppose that the government runs a budget deficit in this period. So in order to fund the deficit, it's going to sell bonds to households. But what this is going to do is decrease the supply of funds that are available to firms, so that firms can get from households to improve their technology and improve their future output. So what this is going to do is shift the supply curve for loanable funds to the left, because now instead of investing in providing funds to firms for investment, households are loaning those funds to the government instead. So what happens is running a deficit by the government has reduced the level of total savings in the economy. And because we've increased the interest rate, it also reduced the level of investment spending by firms. So by borrowing to finance its budget deficit, the government is said to have crowded out some firms that would have otherwise been able to borrow to finance their investments. So crowding out refers to the decline in private expenditures as a result of increases in government purchases. Now, if the government has a budget surplus, we're going to see the opposite take place. Budget surplus is going to increase the total amount of savings in an economy. It's going to shift the supply curve for loanable funds to the right. So in this new equilibrium, we'll see the interest rate will be lower and the quantity of loanable funds will be higher. So how important is crowding out, and how big of a threat do budget deficits pose to an economy? Well, in practice, the effect of deficits is relatively small for the effect on the equilibrium interest rate. According to one study, increasing borrowing by 1% of GDP by the US government would increase the real interest rate by 0.003 points. And the reason this effect would be so small So interest rates are influenced by global markets, of which the United States is just one player. And because there's a lot of loanable funds out there in the global markets, a few $100 billion, which sounds like a lot to us, is a relatively minor amount compared to the total amount of loanable funds. So these budget deficits end up causing some crowding out, but the effect isn't as pronounced because of the globalized economy that we live in today. This slide, we have a summary of the loanable funds model. So we can see what happens with an increase in government budget deficit, the desire of households to consume, tax benefits for savings, and so on. I'm not going to go into depth for each of these, but these are contained in your textbooks and on the PowerPoint slides without the video lectures that I'm going to include in Canvas. So you'll be able to go over these and look and see for yourself exactly what's going on. But it's the same basic idea as changes in the regular markets that we talked about earlier. Section, we're going to explore the business cycle. So while real GDP per capita has risen about 8-fold since the start of the 20th century, we haven't seen it rise consistently every single year. Some years it goes up by a lot, some years it goes up by a little, some years the standard of living actually falls. So since at least the early 19th century, the American economy has experienced alternating periods of expanding and contracting economic periods. And we call these alternating periods the business cycle. Let's cover some basic definitions of the business cycle. The fluctuations in real GDP per capita, as shown in the figure here on the right, reflect the underlying fluctuations in real GDP. So during the expansion phase of the business cycle, so that first period we see on the graph, production, employment, and income are all increasing in the economy. The period of expansion ends with the business cycle peak. The peak is the top. That's the best that the economy is going to do up until this point. And following the peak, production, employment, and income all decline as the economy enters the recession phase of the cycle. The recession is going to come to an end with the business cycle trough, so the lowest point we're going to hit in this period, after which another expansion begins, and the process begins all over again. So this is an idealized version of the business cycle, drawn very simply with standard curved lines to give you a feel of what's going on with real GDP over time, although in reality it's a lot messier looking. In this figure, we see the movements in real GDP in the United States from 2006 to 2015. So as you can see, it's fairly similar to the stylized version of the business cycle on the previous slide, but there's a lot more movement from year to year, and we see some increases and some decreases outside of recessions. So we have the expansion that began in the early 2000s but runs through mid-2007, then a period of recession that begins in late 2007 and ends in mid-2009. Now, this is the longest and the most severe recession since the Great Depression in the 1930s. And because of that, some people began calling it the Great Recession. Afterwards, GDP growth picked up again, so beginning in mid-2009, running through 2015 and all the way up until the beginning of this year, until the coronavirus shutdowns caused the recession of this spring. So real GDP growth after this recession has been slower than is typical at the start of business cycle expansion. Typically we see more what they call catch-up growth, so we get up closer to the path that we were on before the recession. This time, we didn't really see that. So how do we know when the economy enters a recession? Well, the federal government produces a lot of statistics that makes it possible to monitor the state of the economy. But it's not the federal government that officially decides when the recession begins or when it ends or if it's occurring. Instead, most economists and policymakers accept the definitions of the National Bureau of Economic Research, or the NBER, which is a private research group located in Massachusetts. So although writers for newspapers, magazines, online business sites, etc., they often define a recession as 2 consecutive quarters of declining real GDP, the NBER has a broader definition. according to the NBER, a recession is a significant decline in activity spread across the economy, lasting more than a few months, visible in industrial production, employment, real income, and wholesale retail trade. So it's going to cover pretty much all the same situations, but the NBER gives them a little bit more latitude with their definition, a little bit more judgment. And the NBER is fairly slow in announcing business cycle dates because gathering economic statistics takes a lot of time, and then analyzing those statistics can also be quite time consuming. So usually the NBER will announce that the economy is in a recession well after the recession has begun. People may say we're in a recession, but the NBER will usually wait quite a long time till they actually declare that a recession has begun. So this table on the right shows the recessions since World War II. So we had 2 in the 50s, 2 in the 60s, 1 in the 1970s, 2 in the 80s, 1 in 1990, and then 2 in the 2000s. And they all lasted various times, some as short as 6 months, some as long as 16 months. So historically, recessions have been generally followed by periods of strong economic growth. Because we see low interest rates and the failing of other competitors, during a recession or in the immediate aftermath can be a great time for businesses to expand. It offers a fantastic opportunity for them. So as an example, VF Corporation, which is the largest apparel maker in the world, opened 89 new stores in 2008 and 70 in 2009. They took advantage of much lower interest rates and of the destruction of some competitors in order to expand. By 2015, the company's sales and profits continued to increase, so it made their decision in hindsight look very smart, even though it may have looked risky when they decided to do it. When a recession hits, workers reduce their spending due to expectations about their current and future incomes decreasing. When they now think there's a much larger chance that their income is going to fall, whether it's due to unemployment or maybe because their salaries are tied to some sort of incentives, or maybe their wages are tied to the hours worked. During recession, they're much more likely to see or to expect their future incomes will decrease. So we'll see them, because of that, reduce their spending or tend to reduce their spending. But this reduction of spending doesn't affect all goods equally or all types of goods equally. Consumers mostly continue to buy what we call non-durable goods. Non-durable goods are things like food that you consume right away and are a small portion of your overall budget. Now, purchase of durable goods are much more strongly affected by recessions and by the threat of losing your job. So durable goods are ones that are expected to last 3 or more years. These are typically like household appliances, automobiles, much larger expenses, and we typically spend quite a bit of money or even have to take out loans in order to afford them. So in a recession, firms that sell durable goods are much more likely to be hit hard and to suffer than firms that sell non-durable goods. And when economists are looking to try to understand the health of economy, one of the things we look at is durable goods and durable goods orders to see if people are anticipating a chance of losing their job or a reduction in spending. So let's look at an example of the effects of the business cycle on Corning. So what Corning does is sell ceramics for automobile emission systems and display panels for televisions and computers. These are all durable goods, so they're going to be hit particularly hard by the recession. So on the left, we see movements in real GDP. And we see it increasing substantially from 1999 to 2008. Then we see a pretty sharp drop from late 2007, early 2008 through 2009. And then we see it begin to increase at the same pace again. Now, if we look at motor vehicles, so the real value of sales for motor vehicles and for information processing equipment, we see substantial drops in both of those during the recession. Because these are durable goods and these are quite expensive, they're going to be strongly affected by the recession, unlike, say, the real value of sales for food or for other consumer non-durable items. So a company like Corning that sells things that are used in durable goods, they'll be strongly affected by a recession. Cycle also has an impact on the inflation rate. So remember, the price level measures the average prices of goods and services in the economy, and that the inflation rate is the percentage increase in the price level from one year to the next. So an important fact about the business cycle is that the inflation rate usually increases during economic expansions, particularly near the end of an expansion, and the inflation rate usually decreases during recessions. So the graph we're going to show on the next slide shows the movements in CPI inflation over the last 2 decades, so we can illustrate this point. Every recession since 1950, the inflation rate has been lower during the 12 months after the recession than it was during the 12 months before the recession began. The average decline in the inflation rate has been about 2.5 percentage points, and this result should not be surprising. During a business cycle expansion, spending by businesses and households is strong, and the producers of goods and services find it easier to raise prices. Additionally, when there's low unemployment, which we typically see during a business cycle expansion, firms' labor costs increase, as when they want to hire new workers, they're forced to pay higher and higher wages to bid them away from other firms. As spending declines during a recession, firms have more difficulties selling their goods and services and are less likely to increase prices or actually decrease their prices in order to actually sell the goods that they've spent. And we can see here from the last couple recessions that during those red bars, which represent the recessions, we see drops in the inflation rate each time. Recessions at the end of the business cycle may cause inflation to fall, but also causes the unemployment rate to rise. So as firms see their sales decline, they begin to reduce their production and lay off workers. So figure on this slide illustrates this pattern for the previous 3 recessions since 1990. So notice that the unemployment rate continued to rise even after the recessions in 90 to 91, 2001, and 07 to 09 had ended. So this lag before the unemployment rate begins to decline is typical for 2 reasons. The first is, even though employment begins to increase as a recession ends, it may be increasing more slowly than the increase in labor force resulting from population growth and as people graduate from school or look for jobs for the first time. If employment increases slowly enough relative to the growth of the labor force, it is possible for the unemployment rate to rise. And secondly, some firms continue to operate well below their capacity even after a recession have ended and sales have begun to increase. So as a result, at first, firms may not hire back all the workers they have laid off and may even continue for a while to lay off more workers. During the recession since 1950, the unemployment rate has risen on an average about 1.2 percentage points during the 12 months after a recession has ended. So on average, more than 1 million more workers have been unemployed during the 12 months after a recession has begun than during the previous 12 months. On this slide, we see the year-to-year percentage change in real GDP since 1990. This figure illustrates that before 1950, real GDP went through much greater year-to-year fluctuations than it has since then. Fluctuations since, say, the mid-1980s have been particularly mild. And by the early 21st century, some economists had begun referring to the absence of severe recessions in the United States as the Great Moderation. We saw 2 very, very slight recessions in 1990 and in 2001. All this came to a crashing halt with the recession that began in late 2007, because it was the longest and most severe recession since the Great Depression. Despite that we saw this unusual severity in the 2007-2009 recession, we still have had much smaller fluctuations in real GDP over the past 40, 50 years than we had before that. So let's look at over time what the business cycle has been like to see how it's become more mild. So from 1870 to 1900, the average length of expansion was 26 months. So it took on average about 26 months for the economy to improve, so go from trough to the peak. But then the average length of recession was 26 months. So we had long periods of recession. From 1900 to 1950, the average length of expansions were 25 months. and the average length of recession was 19 months. So the average length of expansions were longer than the length of recessions, but not by too much, only by 6 months. Compare that with 1950 to 2009, the so-called Great Moderation. The average length of expansions were 61 months, and the average length of recessions were only 11 months. So we had much, much longer and slower increases in GDP growth, and then much shorter recessions than we've seen in the past. So we'll end this chapter by touching on a few of the possible causes of the Great Moderation. The first is the increasing importance of services. So manufacturing, and especially the manufacturing of durable goods, is more strongly affected by recessions. So when the economy was a greater percentage of economic output in the United States was the manufacturing sector, we would expect it to be much more affected by the emergence of recessions. Now that the economy is based more on providing services, that would decrease the effect of the business cycle on GDP. So that should tend to smooth it out. And this was Paul Krugman's hypothesis dating back about 30 years now. Another possibility is the establishment of unemployment insurance. So before the 1930s, unemployment insurance and other government transfer programs, things like Social Security, they did not exist. These programs increase the ability of consumers to purchase goods and services during recessions. Because they have this buffer, they have money they're going to receive from the government, their incomes aren't hit as bad. So we don't see as much of a decrease in demand from consumers during a recession as we used to see in the past. So this may decrease the severity or the length of time that these recessions last for. Next is active federal government that engages in stabilization policies during recessions. There's a large number of economists that believe that active government policies to lengthen expansion and to minimize the effects of recessions have had the desired effect. Basic idea is that now that the government is engaging in these policies and actively, not passively in the past, like providing unemployment insurance, but true active involvement in the economy has been able to stabilize some of these things. So this is like discretionary spending, like stimulus spending in the face of recession. And the final is increased stability of the financial system. So the severity of the Great Depression in the 1930s was in part caused by the instability of the financial system. Although the Great Depression was truly a worst case scenario where several very important things went wrong at the same time. And we saw similar instability exacerbated in the recession from 2007 to 2009, although it was nowhere near as bad as the Great Depression. So in order to have macroeconomic stability, it's important to have a stable financial system.